Hey, what's up everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. As any of you who are watching this can see, I am in a slightly new environment. We just moved a little bit after the 4th of July holiday, so things are looking a little bit different, but I think the space will work just fine. If you're just listening to me, then this doesn't really mean anything to you. But for those of you that are watching, you can see that I moved. It's a big part of the reason, really the reason for the delay between the last episode and this one. Sorry about that, but I think those of you who have moved a few times know what a colossal pain in the ass that can be. But enough about that. On we go with the show. I'm going to pick up from where I left off the last time, the march of the United States into the War of 1812. In the last episode, I discussed the buildup to the War of 1812 during the first Madison administration. I talked about how Madison as a person was not a natural fit for a position like the presidency, and how it was that he ended up as the chief executive in spite of the fact that he was not necessarily a good fit for the job in the same way that Washington and Jefferson had been. I talked about the many challenges that Madison faced as he took office, including divisions in the country and within his own political party, the territorial issues in Florida, and the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. And most of all, of course, I discussed the incredibly difficult foreign policy mess that Madison had to deal with as he became president. The fact that Britain and France were still at war, and both Britain and France were disrespecting American ships and American sovereignty. In particular, Madison was deeply disappointed that the measures of the so-called restrictive regime, all the commercial sanctions from the Embargo Act to Macon's Bill No. 2, did not achieve the goals that he had hoped that these policies would achieve, or that Jefferson hoped these policies would achieve. Finally, I talked about how the failure of nonviolent coercion under the restrictive regime, including the Embargo Act, Macon's Bill No. 2, the Non-Intercourse Act, all that stuff, eventually led Madison and the 12th Congress to declare war on Britain in June of 1812. In this episode, I will discuss the prosecution of the War of 1812 through 1812 and into 1813, what those who promulgated and managed the war hoped to achieve by fighting it, the significant resistance to the war within the United States, and finally, the Baltimore Riots of 1812 and the presidential election that took place at the end of that year. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe and spread the word if you are so inclined. If you're enjoying what I'm doing so far, liking, subscribing, spreading the word to other people, friends, family, colleagues, fellow students, if you're a student, whoever you think might be interested in it is the best way to keep this going. So if you're enjoying what I'm doing, please, please, please like and subscribe, spread the word. Thanks very much. As usual, before I get into the main content of the episode, I'm going to give you all the resources that I used to put this episode together, as well as a main question to think about while I go through all of the information. The resources are basically the same as they were in the last episode. Of course, I'm using The American Pageant, the common AP U.S. History textbook, as well as Give Me Liberty, another common AP U.S. History textbook. There is Empire of Liberty, the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period by Gordon S. Wood. And then there are the two books that I introduced in the last episode that are new that I'll still be using for this and the following episode. And the first of those is The Presidency of James Madison by Robert Allen Rutland. And the second is The War of 1812 by Donald R. Hickey. Those were both very helpful. They focused largely on the War of 1812 because the presidency of James Madison, of course, is taken up in large part by that conflict. The question that I think it would be good for you guys to think about as I'm going through all of this stuff is as follows. What broad goals did Madison and Republicans hope to accomplish as a result of the War of 1812? What was their strategy for winning the war? And why did it all go so horribly wrong from the outset through most of 1813. I'll say that one more time. What broad goals did Madison and Republicans hope to accomplish as a result of the War of 1812? What was their strategy for winning the war? And why did it all go so horribly wrong from the outset of the war through most of 1813? So think about that as I am relating all of the facts. I think it will help you to get a better understanding of everything that I'm covering. First of all, what did the Republicans and Madison hope to get out of the war? Well, John Calhoun, who was one of the most important figures in the effort to push for war against Great Britain, he was one of the most prominent war hawks. That's the group of mostly Southern and Western congressmen in the House of Representatives from places like South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and so forth, who were actively pushing to go to war with Britain in order to defend what they saw as American pride and sovereignty. He, Calhoun, was on the House Committee for Foreign Relations. He was the primary author, was Calhoun, of a report from that committee produced in the spring of 1812, and that report put it this way: Americans would show, quote, the world that we have not only inherited that liberty, which our fathers gave us, but also the will and power to maintain it. So the message, of course, there is we are the next generation of political leaders of the United States, and we are not going to let down our forefathers who founded the United States, got us away from Great Britain, and established this great country that we now have to defend as a legitimate partner, as a legitimate participant in the community of nations worldwide. For Americans, this war was about sovereignty and respect, forcing the world in general and Great Britain in particular to treat the United States as an equal party among the world's nation states and not just some third-rate former colony that might be forced into subjugation all over again whenever it suited the great powers of Europe. Impressment, in particular, had been the most vexing issue for Americans of all stripes, but the inability to trade as they wished with the world and the cavalier manner with which Britain and France seized American ships made Madison and Republicans in Congress feel that it was a choice among embargo, which had failed, accommodation, which was insufferable to American pride, and war. From their points of view, the Republicans and Madison and many others who wanted to stand up for American independence and sovereignty, there was no longer any real choice but war. So even though many congressmen had routinely voted against funding desperately needed and entirely cogent war preparations, the United States declared war against Britain while simultaneously being wholly unprepared for the fight. In June of 1812, there were fewer than 7,000 regular troops spread all over the country, and a War Department that was enfeebled and disorganized because of years of neglect. All of this was meant to fight a force in Great Britain that had a regular army of 250,000 soldiers, which for the time was massive. And, of course, Great Britain had the world's best navy, had the world's best navy for quite a long time, and it had in it, this navy, over 1,000 existing ships with 600 then active. So why did Democratic Republicans feel this war was so necessary and voted so well for the United States? Well, part of the explanation can be found in the fact that 63 freshman House members, many of whom had no memory of the struggles of the Revolutionary War, had overwhelmingly voted in favor of this war and believed that an undoubtedly triumphant invasion of Canada would bring the disparate political factions of the Democratic-Republican Party together in a chorus of patriotism. That was one reason that they were so enthusiastic about declaring war against Great Britain, because the party was divided, and this was seen as a way of bringing the disparate factions together. They even believed, did these pro-war, enthusiastic, patriotic, young Democratic Republicans in mostly the House of Representatives, that a war with Britain would necessitate a détente with the contrarian and bitter Federalists who would have to, because of the war, rally around the flag. Republicans all over the country wanted an end to impressment, but were even more certain that a successful war would force the British, and likely the French, to finally back off American shipping, which both countries had messed with a lot since about 1805, and they would have to back off American shipping, seizing American ships, by revoking their trade restrictions. And that would, in turn, the revocation of these trade restrictions would bring back the prosperity of 1795 to 1805 that Americans had known when they were engaging in the re-export trade, carrying on a lot of trade worldwide. I talked about how much the United States expanded into the international trade market in those years and how much prosperity it brought to the country. Those Republicans believed that once the trade restrictions imposed by Britain and France went away, the good times would come roaring back. And this would be good for both merchants in the East and farmers in the West. Everybody would be happy. Some Republicans even thought that just the declaration of war would be enough to get Britain to finally cave to American demands about stopping impressment and opening up trade with Britain and with the continent. In a way, Madison and others thought of declaring war as just another negotiating tactic, and something of a bluff that would get the British to give the United States what it had been asking for years. Most Democratic Republicans also believed that the war would finally help to end the country's long-standing Indian problem. A British defeat would deny Native Americans their most powerful ally and best source of the materials that the Native Americans needed to make war on the various American frontier locations, is for the most part where the Indians would attack. And that would be a great thing, because the United States was having to spend a lot of resources, military resources at this time, defending frontier settlements from various Native American tribes who might attack. Democratic Republicans hoped that Federalist opposition to the war would evaporate in a surge of patriotism, but that turned out to be naively optimistic and short-lived, to the extent that it happened at all. After mostly voting against the war declaration, there was a unified front of Federalists in every part of the country who openly opposed the war, perhaps best exemplified by Josiah Quincy's op-ed, which decried the fight with Britain as dangerous for the United States, unnecessary, and one that the U.S. was not remotely prepared to fight. Given that, Republicans pushed to continue trade restrictions and voted to increase customs duties, both of which disproportionately harmed Federalist economic strongholds in the Northeast, and that they pushed for a land war in Canada rather than a more limited seafaring war against the British Royal Navy, which had actually disrespected American sovereignty. It's not surprising that Federalist opposition to the war was so uniform and so vociferous, because from the Federalist point of view, this war was going to further damage the economy of the Northeast, the trading economy that was so important to so many folks in that part of the country. And this was not a defensive war. This was an aggressive war, a war of aggression from the Federalist point of view. The Federalists, knew that the strategy was going to be to go after Canada. It was already out there, more or less in the open, and that was not a war that they could see justifying, because the Canadians had not done anything to the United States. It had been the British Royal Navy. I still think that had the Democratic Republicans stuck to a policy of going after the British Navy or of defending coastal positions or whatever would not have included something that could be as easily perceived as a war of aggression, I still think the Federalists would have opposed it, but maybe they wouldn't have had as much of a leg to stand on in terms of looking principled. So as I already said, it's kind of an open secret that the invasion of Canada is going to be the main strategy for prosecuting this war. It was all but universally assumed among members of the Madison Administration, the military leadership, and various Republican leaders all over the country that the U.S. was going to walk right into Canada and take over all the major population centers without breaking a sweat. After all, Canada was sparsely populated. There were only about 500,000 people in Canada in every part of the territory versus 8 million in the United States at the time. It was the population of Canada, not strictly English in culture and loyalty to Britain. Remember that there are a lot of French Canadians who had only relatively recently become a part of the British Empire because of the 7 Years' War, back before the Revolution. And there are all of these immigrants that came from different parts of the world who were not necessarily English or loyal to Britain. And Britain was occupied at the time still with Napoleon in Europe. So all of those factors, the fact that there were so many fewer people in Canada, that those people that were there were so spread out over this big territory, that a lot of those people might not have been instinctively loyal to Great Britain, and the fact that Britain was occupied with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and had to divert all of its resources there, many Americans figured, yeah, we're just going to march right into Canada. It'll be a push-up. I mean, we'll be done in a month. You know, what are they going to do, these Canadians? I mean, give me a break. But they were in for a very big surprise, as it turned out. As former President Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to William Duane, the editor of the very Republican partisan newspaper, the Philadelphia Aurora, in August of 1812, quote, "The acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us experience for the attack of Halifax the next, and the final expulsion of England from the American continent," unquote. So even a guy like Jefferson, who probably should have known better, was touting this as just a pushover military victory that the United States wouldn't have to even think too much about or organize too well in order to accomplish. It was, as he said, a mere matter of marching. Famous last words. Congress had done just about everything possible to hamstring the military, with both its stubborn refusal to properly fund the war effort in the months and even years leading up to the war, and its insistence on political priorities when appointing officers and apportioning martial authority to states rather than to the federal government. Much was expected from state militia forces, but they ended up being more of a hindrance than anything, as they repeatedly made the case that constitutional principles wouldn't allow them to even set foot in Canada. So if your plan is to march into Canada, take it over, make the British negotiate from a position of strength as a result of possessing Canada, using a force that refuses to actually set foot in Canada is kind of a problem. Congress had also abolished the quartermaster and commissary departments of the military and had drastically reduced the size of the War Department, all during Jefferson's presidency and all in the interest of saving money. All of these reductions had to be reversed in order to make the military campaigns even functional, though they greatly suffered from the resulting disorganization and poor logistics for the duration of the war. What the federal government, what the Republicans did to the federal government, to the War Department in particular, was a huge problem for how the war was prosecuted till the end, till it was over in late 1814, kind of early 1815. I'll get to that eventually. Supplying and organizing large armies in the wilderness of Canada would have been extremely difficult, even with a completely competent officer corps and a fully staffed military bureaucracy. But under the circumstances, the poor planning, lack of coordination, and horrid supply issues, the most effective commanding officers attributed their worst troop losses to lack of food and proper gear rather than to enemy combatants. All of that, it took a horrid toll. The existing issues were exacerbated by unscrupulous civilian agents who were contracted to supply American forces and looked for every opportunity to cut expenses and line their own pockets. All of these issues, along with delays of many months before soldiers received their pay, led to horrible morale and an epidemic of desertions. As if all of these problems were not enough, the officer corps was utterly unfit for command. According to one of the very few officers who showed great ability right from the start of hostilities, General Winfield Scott. Most officers were either old men who had, quote, very generally sunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intemperate drinking, unquote, or younger men with no relevant experience and had achieved their rank via political cronyism. So they were officers because they knew the right people in the political elites of the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, not because they showed great potential as commanding officers. As a man with little experience of or appetite for knowledge of military affairs, President Madison chose to lean on the advice of his Secretary of War, William Eustis, and his most senior officer that summer, Major General Henry Dearborn. Unfortunately, Eustis was out of his depth as an administrator, and Dearborn was, like his colleague Major General Thomas Pinckney, a Revolutionary War veteran in his 60s who had spent more time in the political rather than military arena since that conflict. So at best, Dearborn was out of practice as a general. Both Eustis and Dearborn endorsed a three-pronged attack into Canada. One prong would go from Lake Champlain to threaten Montreal. A second would progress along the Niagara River. And a third in the west that would target Upper Canada, as they called it, just north of the Great Lakes and the Old Northwest Territory. Eustis and Dearborn sold Madison on a sweeping drive into all three spaces that would easily clear any Canadian resistance, cede control of Canada to the United States, and force Britain to negotiate. But the aforementioned supply problems, the horrendous leadership of the commanding officers, and the total absence of any coordination among the three attacking armies, which would have been vital to making such a complicated maneuver work at all. They all came together to make the campaigns of 1812 in Canada an unmitigated disaster. Perhaps the most embarrassing and the lowest point in the war for the U.S. occurred just 2 months after war had been declared. General William Hull, after repeated retreats and refusals to attack for fear of British and Indian troop strength that he overestimated, surrendered Fort Detroit without firing a shot. This was in the westernmost of the three prongs of the attack in the Old Northwest into Upper Canada. He surrendered Fort Detroit without firing a shot because he was freaked out about what he thought was this potentially humongous British and Native American force that would then go into the civilian areas and slaughter everybody. But he was wrong, and he kept delaying, and there were all kinds of problems between him and his junior officers. There were a lot of people who wanted to ditch him, even in the process, as all of this was going on, as Hull continued to refuse to attack. The British commander, Major General Isaac Brock, then announced, once Hull gave up Fort Detroit, Brock announced the annexation of the entire Michigan Territory to Great Britain. So Hull surrenders Fort Detroit, and then Brock says, oh, we have all the Michigan Territory now. That doesn't make it so because he's saying it, but I mean, on paper, or theoretically at least, that means the United States just lost a big chunk of territory when they were thinking, the leadership was anyway, that they were just going to waltz right into Canada and take over the whole place. So Hull was ultimately court-martialed and found guilty of cowardice and negligence, and spared the firing squad only because of Madison's pardon. But equally pernicious command incompetence doomed the middle prong of the invasion, the one along the Niagara River, as political infighting among the generals and a refusal by New York militia to fight on foreign soil resulted in a defeat and capture of over 900 American troops, including Winfield Scott, by the way, at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October of 1812, just near Fort Niagara. Meanwhile, General Dearborn, who had masterminded this entire debacle, seemed much more interested in administering the buildup of coastal fortifications in New England than in marching the troops under his command northward to Montreal, as his own plan had dictated. Only in November of 1812, after an exasperated Secretary Eustis repeatedly pushed him to move, did Dearborn finally get going. But again, state militia refused to cross international borders to fight, and Dearborn eventually turned back without accomplishing anything. really. On top of all of this command incompetence, manpower issues contributed to the disastrous invasion of Canada in the fall of 1812, as the government managed to recruit less than 10,000 men by that November out of the 25,000 Congress had approved to be added to the existing army. Given the low pay, $5 a month for new privates entering the army, the disorganization at the War Department, and the lack of general staff that often couldn't even give recruits a decent uniform and pair of shoes, the underwhelming numbers were not surprising. The invasion of Canada could not have turned out more differently than its wildly optimistic proponents had claimed it would. For a time at least, the U.S. lost territory rather than gained it, and it was exposed as being woefully unprepared for a war of conquest into a territory held by one of the world's great military powers. Maybe the biggest challenge the United States faced during the entire war was paying for it. Congress had decided in early 1812, before the war was declared on Britain, that it did not think increasing the size of the Navy to match up with the world's most formidable force on the seas was a good investment. In fact, Congress provided even less funding for the Navy than for the Army, as the House defeated a January 1812 proposal to build 12 ships of the line, which were the biggest and best warships. That was what the biggest and best warships in the age of sail at this point were called, ships of the line, and 24 frigates, which are the early 19th century equivalent of cruisers. They're smaller and faster than ships of the line. Nathaniel Macon was one of many Republicans in Congress who voted against all attempts to build up and arm the Navy, voted against increased funding for the War Department, voted against every tax increase proposed, and still voted to go to war in June of 1812, which is fucking bonkers if you think about it. It's like, okay, I'm not going to vote for any of the stuff that we might need to actually fight this thing, but yeah, let's go to war. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Add it to the list. Republicans had also decided to kill the Bank of the United States, as I mentioned in the previous episode, in 1811. So even though they would have to lean on borrowing to fund the war because they refused to pay for it with new taxes, they had eliminated their best option for securing the necessary loans to fund the war. Financing the war was a constant problem, and it was very common for troops not to have received pay for 6 months or more by the fall of 1814. Eventually, the United States partially defaulted on some of its debt during the 1814-1815 fiscal crisis. Initially, Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton advised Madison that the U.S. should acknowledge British naval superiority and not even send American warships out into the open ocean. There were only 17 ships in total, as I mentioned, with no ships of the line, 7 frigates, and 9 sloops or other manner of smaller ships. Even with this tiny force, the Navy had trouble keeping the ships manned, though, as it competed for manpower with the Army and with privateering ships, which could potentially make a lot of money seizing merchant ships. Those could be very fruitful, lucrative missions, taking down a merchant ship that had all kinds of valuable goods in it. Secretary Hamilton was overruled in his recommendation by Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Madison, who thought the best policy was to have warships protect American merchant ships, mostly by guiding them into American ports. This was largely effective in 1812 and much of 1813, and, along with the demand on British naval resources in Europe, helped prevent Britain from a truly effective blockade of the U.S. in 1812 and into a big chunk of 1813. Many of the only real bright spots for the United States as it waged war in 1812 were, somewhat surprisingly, in naval engagements. In August, the USS Constitution defeated the British frigate Guerriere, I'm not sure how to say it. It's Guerriere. however you say that, Guerriere, I don't know. After the Constitution inflicted heavy damage on this British ship and her crew, the Constitution defeated it. The ship struck its colors, and it was done. Later that December, the Constitution defeated another British frigate, the Java, off the coast of Brazil. Kind of appropriate. In October of 1812, a different frigate, the USS United States, defeated another British frigate, the Macedonian, and a prize crew eventually hauled the battered British vessel, the Macedonian, into Newport Harbor, where it was ultimately repaired and added to the American Navy. There were also American sloops, which are about 20-gun ships, like the Wasp and the Hornet. Kind of see a pattern there with the names, that took down British ships in various parts of the Atlantic. There were 8 sloop and brig confrontations during the entirety of the war, I believe, and the Americans got the better of it in all but one of them, if you can believe that. It was shocking and humiliating to the British to lose these one-on-one ship battles as the supposed master of the seas, which is how everybody looked at the British Empire and certainly the British Navy. And it was a wholly new experience for Great Britain to lose these kinds of battles. In 20 years of one-on-one engagements between British and French frigates, the British had been defeated one time. So for the United States to perform this well was pretty remarkable. And from what I read, it had something to do with the fact that the British were trying to preserve resources. They didn't run firing drills and did not exercise, so to speak, the necessary muscles of their navy to be adequately prepared for some of these fights with Americans. And Americans didn't have that problem. And they did run drills and prepare and were pretty able seamen relative to a lot of other countries' inhabitants. So it did surprise Britain, and it surprised even a lot of Americans, but it's not totally unbelievable when you think about what was going on. American privateers, again, that's the sort of government-employed pirates, if you will, wreaked havoc on the British merchant marine in the Atlantic, both near British possessions in the Western Hemisphere, like the British West Indies and places like that, and in the sea lanes not far off European coasts. In just the first 6 months of the war, privateers mostly patrolling the waters off the coast of Canada and around the West Indies captured roughly 450 vessels. Privateers were arguably the most effective military asset the U.S. had during the war with Great Britain, as they forced the British Navy to concentrate on protecting commerce rather than using those resources to bombard American harbors or provide cover for invading British armies. Privateers seized well over 1,200 British merchant ships throughout the course of the war and inflicted millions of dollars in damage that helped turn public opinion in the UK against the continued war effort once especially Napoleon had been defeated. The victories at sea, and no doubt the defeats on land, along with Madison's continued prodding, finally pushed Congress to pay for the construction of 6 additional frigates and 4 ships of the line in January 1813. At the same time, Congress approved the raising of 22,000 additional troops and voted for a pay increase that seemed utterly necessary at that point to boost enlistments, which, as I said, had been lagging. Of course, with continuing Republican refusal to raise taxes and with no central bank to make borrowing the funds far less complicated, paying for all of this became extremely difficult. The partial blockade on imports that severely reduced tariff revenues and the active and organized resistance to lending the federal government money for a war that they opposed among moneyed men in the Northeast made financing the war even more complicated. Ultimately, the situation improved only because a Russian offer to mediate for peace reached the U.S. in March 1813 and made potential lenders feel as though the conflict might soon be over, with normal economic operations to be continued shortly thereafter. So you get that? It's like the only reason that some people began to open up their pocketbooks and buy government securities, basically lending the government money to prosecute the war, was that there was this possibility of a peace being struck, negotiated with the assistance of Russia, and that would mean when the war was over, normal economic functions would return, and the government could take in revenue, and these investors who were lending the government money might be a lot more assured of getting their money back. Congressional Republicans did finally pass a tax bill in June of 1813, but it was not to go into effect until 1814. The bill included a direct tax on land, a tax on imported salt, and other taxes on stills, retailers, sugar, carriages, and other goods and services. As we will see, however, this was not nearly enough to cover both the costs of the war and the debt that had already accumulated as a result of those costs. Of course, another feature of this war was the fighting on the frontier. I already mentioned that the British were the most important ally of Native American tribes who were adversarial to the United States, to American settlers who had been encroaching on their territory for, at this point, decades. Madison met with a delegation of Fox, Sauk, and Osage Native Americans in August of 1812, just as the disastrous Hull surrender was taking place, because he, like many other American civilian and military leaders, was deeply concerned about Native American violence on the frontier. As I've said, the Indians were allied and encouraged by the British for decades. They had been supplied with guns to make trouble for the United States during the Revolutionary War and certainly after it. That was a big issue before the Jay Treaty was signed in 1795, was the British supporting Native American hostilities on the American frontier. This was, again, another reason why a lot of Republicans wanted to prosecute the war. They hoped that they could solve both the British problem and the Native American problem simultaneously. But it turned out that Madison should have been concerned with Native Americans in the Southwest, in addition to those in the Old Northwest, like the Fox, Sauk, Osage, etc., because it would not be long into the War of 1812 before another theater of fighting would open up against Native Americans in and around Georgia, Florida, and various parts of the Mississippi Territory. More on that next episode. In the Old Northwest, though, there were a number of instances in which Native Americans fought alongside or independent of the British against American military forces. They also conducted raids on frontier communities in many locations. It had been the threat of Indian attacks on civilians, remember, in the Michigan Territory that had largely pushed General William Hull to surrender Fort Detroit and the surrounding area to the British without any actual fighting. White Americans had been encroaching ever more on native lands after the Treaty of Greenville, which was signed in 1795, and some natives had been organizing to fight back, probably best exemplified by Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, aka the Prophet. Many saw this new conflict, the War of 1812, as a real chance to terminate the invasion of their lands. Many Native Americans saw it that way. There were attacks and mass killings of soldiers and civilians beginning in the summer of 1812 by Native Americans, such as the Fort Dearborn massacre in August in what is now the Chicago area. There was also the Raisin River massacre that took place in January of 1813, just after a combined British and Indian army defeated an American force at the Battle of Frenchtown. At least 30 American prisoners were killed, these prisoners that were taken after the Battle of Frenchtown, by mostly Potawatomi Indians who were probably drunk. Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, warriors led by Mohawk Captain John Norton played a major role in the British victory against American forces at the Battle of Queenston Heights. I mentioned that before. That was part of the Niagara campaign where Winfield Scott was captured, which has since the Battle of Queenston Heights taken a very prominent place in Canadian nationalist lore, not unlike the Battle of Trenton for Americans. If you look into Canadian history, it is a seminal moment for Canadians, for their national identity, their victory at Queenston Heights, where from their point of view, they could have been taken over by the United States. and incorporated into the United States, but because of that battle, possibly, it didn't happen. All of the defeats along the Canadian border, but particularly in the West, meant that Indians did not have much to check their advances on white settlements in various areas of the frontier. And as had been the pattern up to that point, attacks and recriminations for these attacks led to a particularly brutal set of conflicts for the remainder of the war in the various parts of the American frontier. Okay, last couple things I want to mention before I stop here for this episode. Number one, there is a big riot in Baltimore that takes place in 1812 that I want to talk about. And I also want to talk about the election, the presidential election. There are also, of course, congressional elections in November of 1812. There had been a number of not so subtle forms of intimidation targeted at Americans who sought to oppose the War of 1812 for one reason or another. This opposition was most acute, the opposition to the war, in New England and New York City, because there were still a substantial number of Federalists there in those places, and because they were both so dependent on trade with Britain that was directly threatened, undercut by the war. Most of the largest cities in the U.S. tended to oppose the war for similar reasons. The notable exception being Baltimore, which was, by the time of the War of 1812, the third largest city in the United States, population about 47,000. It had surpassed Boston as the third largest city. And it was Baltimore, by many folks, whether you're talking about French refugees from the war in Europe or from Haiti, Irish and German immigrants, Americans with commercial ties to the French Empire. All of these people had an axe to grind with Great Britain. And because of that, this was a city that was much more pro-war than, say, Philadelphia or New York City. The violence and intimidation that had been in some instances stoked by Republican officials in the city exploded into mob violence when the publisher of a pro-Federalist newspaper, the Federal Republican, by the name of Alexander Conti Hanson, dared to rebuild his offices and publish his paper again after a mob had destroyed his original headquarters, subsequent to the paper having denounced the declaration of war. What I'm saying is that this paper denounced the declaration of war. A mob came around and destroyed what had been its original offices, had been around for I'm not sure how long. And then this guy rebuilt his office again in Baltimore. That's where our conflict picks up. When the paper returned to this new office about a month later, a mob once again gathered outside its office, and a standoff began that would last for at least a couple of days. Those who stayed to defend their property, the office, were armed and eventually fired at the crowd as it charged, killing at least one man and wounding a number of others. Eventually, the 24 or so Federalists defending the office were persuaded to be taken to the local jail for their protection. I mean, they really had to be persuaded quite a bit because they didn't feel safe, but it happened. And then their reasons for not wanting to go to the jail became pretty apparent. The mob eventually laid siege to the jail and severely beat, stabbed, and generally mutilated about 10 of the Federalists. Not all of them went to the jail, and some of them were able to escape, but 10 of them got it real bad. One of the Federalists died immediately, while others suffered permanent injuries that typically led to early deaths within 6 or 7 years. One of them was Revolutionary War veteran and hero, Light Horse Henry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. And he was one of the guys that was on the bad end of one of these beatings and didn't live long after it occurred. Local politicians, police, and militia were little to no help in the matter in trying to protect these Federalists, and no one was ever convicted on any charges for the violence, though there were some criminal trials later. As far as the election in 1812 was concerned, there were some cynics who argued that Madison had eventually encouraged a declaration of war and signed it to save his political hide, that things were not going so great for his presidency, and that he was trying to save his ass politically by signing this declaration of war and getting people to rally around his presidency. These folks, claimed his prospects looked bad in early 1812 as the economy continued to suffer because of the various portions, the various measures of the restricted regime, and as he, Madison, contended with oppositional factions of congressmen in his own party. This was the first time an election would be held in America during wartime, and as far as I've read, there appeared to be no serious considerations to delay or postpone it indefinitely. That seems in keeping with the character of both the Democratic-Republican Party and with the political views of James Madison, because they thought democracy was uber important, maintaining the republic was of the utmost importance. And so even though things were extraordinary, there's a war going on, you got to keep the machinery of the republic, of democracy, in motion. It seems unlikely to me that Madison was in any real electoral danger in 1812, although the war did briefly enhance the political prospects of some Federalists. Republicans maintained control of Congress and the presidency, but Federalists made modest gains in the House and in most of the state houses in New England and in New York. There were some contemporaries who argued that the late naval victories in 1812 saved Madison from defeat, but I honestly don't find those arguments terribly persuasive based on the materials that I've read, and the elections, how they turned out in the fall, seem to kind of back up the idea that Madison wasn't in a whole lot of political danger. So that's it for this episode. Thanks very much, as always, for watching. I appreciate your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'm going to get into the end of the war, the second half of the war, in the next episode. This was the 40th of the episodes that I've done. So if you've been with me from the beginning, I am so grateful. Again, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Spread the word. Let your friends and family and colleagues and everybody else know about it. I'd really appreciate that. And if you would like to contact me, you can do so at howthehelldowegethherepod@gmail.com. You can also leave me a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again, take care, and I will see you all next time.